into the first section of this workshop, which is going to be about types of verticals. Ilija, take it away.
Actually, I think that's me. So hi everyone. It's just a brief note before we get into the specific categories we'll be discussing in this section. So namely, we'll be looking at three types of vertical extensions. First, the ones where you're filling in a burden in your top half team's case. Second, the ones where you're expanding on an impact your top half has brought up but hasn't quite explained. And thirdly, on ones where you're hitting the same burdens, but giving better reasons for lack of a better way of putting it. But before that, just a brief note on what a vertical extension is and why you should learn how to run them. If we can get the next slide, please. So the main thing to note is that there is no clean separation between verticals and horizontals in a sense, because that would require everyone to agree what it is that separates one argument from another. And clearly, in any motion, different people are going to divide their case in different ways. So, what you may think of as a horizontal extension might be a vertical extension of the same argument for somebody else. But broadly speaking, the clearest cases of a vertical will be ones where you're running something that is quite similar to what your top half team has already touched on. So that is, you're either aiming for the same sort of outcome, you're either aiming for the same like claim or premise which you're trying to demonstrate in order to like fill in the ultimate argument they're making, or it's something that like very neatly follows from the clash the top half has already taken usually. So generally speaking, whether your extension in this vertical will depend on how many burdens and steps you share with the work your top half team has done. And a vertical may either come in some of the earlier steps of the argument. So this will often look like explaining why characterization is true, for example, or why an outcome is likely. Or it may come in filling in something like the weighing or the impacting that is necessary for the argument to be most persuasive. So it's taking any part of the case your top half team has put. Either it's a part that's missing or it's a part that may be there and done better, and essentially trying to win the round or to place more highly by doing that differently or better than your top half has. The next slide we have then is, why is it that you should learn how to do verticals? Because this is a very common question. Like, verticals are treated as difficult or scary by many people. And I think it's important to discuss what they uniquely give you when you learn how to do them. The first one is that by knowing how to do verticals, you're never locking yourself out of the strongest arguments in a round. And the important thing to note is that the point of learning verticals isn't that you should always be running vertical extensions, but rather is that they unlock like options in your toolkit when you're in back half. And the important thing with back half is that you're limited in the arguments you can run because of the rules of mean derivative, of course. And in order to compensate for that, you want to make sure you have access to as many options as possible. So by learning to do verticals, you're essentially opening new extension paths that can help you win debates in cases where you may have lost if you insisted in running a horizontal. And the important thing is that for many motions, there will often be few key issues that are being discussed. Things like, individual freedoms, for example, things like economic prosperity, etc., etc. And if you really try to insist on running a horizontal, you end up pushing yourself away from the core and the important parts of a debate. And often it's the case that when you look at a motion, the things that appear to be most important initially will continue being important during the round. And of course, you can try to do some of the usual mental gymnastics to weigh off like a horizontal extension that can be a bit wild, or to show why nuclear war happens, as teams may do in some of the lower rooms in some very common motions. But the truth is, you often do far better by sticking close to the heart of the round. And to do that in back half, you need to know how to run verticals in very many rounds. The other thing then is that you shouldn't be running horizontal extensions that you don't really believe in. And what I mean here isn't to believe in personally. And of course, in debates, we often run arguments we don't personally agree with. But rather, you shouldn't be gaslighting yourself into thinking that this very complicated horizontal extension is going to work, and this very implausible result is going to win the round. But rather, verticals let you be a bit more honest with yourself and try to level with the judges in finding some of the actual weaknesses and gaps in top half instead of trying to make something up. And the last thing to note is that verticals are strictly necessary to do well in stronger rooms at majors. And that's true because in weaker rooms, your top half will have missed something very obvious, or they may have missed like the whole argument, which is round winning. In that case, you just run the horizontal, you win the debate with it. But as the rooms get harder, teams start insulating themselves against back half because they know what you're going to try to do. And opening government and opening opposition can think of ways to try to thwart you before top half even finishes. So this will either look like opening teams narrowing down the debate using like the modeling power or the counterprop they have. They may, for example, agree on certain key characterizations to try to make those issues off clash when back half comes around. But also, secondly, top half teams will often try to burn through arguments, which is where they cover parts of different claims that they anticipate you might try running as a horizontal, so that the judges don't think those are completely new and perhaps think you're actually being derivative. So in any of these cases, we have to be ready to position the case we're running and to explain why, even though we're running an argument that may sound or appear similar to what top half has said, it's actually different and possibly round winning in itself. So the next part then is just some examples that Amitai will run us through of vertical extensions.
Cool. So everyone, it's time for the promised game time. What we're going to do here is, if we could move on to the next slide, just have two motions where, just based on your understanding of verticals and of the broad definition we provided until now, which is, the question of how many steps they share with the top half argument, we're going to go through a few arguments that bottom half can make, and I want you to tell me whether you think these would be vertical extensions, and in what ways would they be verticals? What steps would they be filling, or for what reasons they wouldn't be verticals? And this exercise is sort of useful, not just for spotting them, which, as Chris mentioned, is often not very important, since the definition of a vertical is often very hazy, and the question is a contribution to the round. The reason this is important is more in order to sort of show the way in which verticals should very much be thought of as an exercise of identifying which steps and which burdens the top half has already had a claim on, and which ones are new, or which ones we don't need to rely on or prove independently. So let's start with the first motion, which is this house regrets the rise of situationships. And let's run down very quickly through what the top half would have looked like in this round. So opening government would make one central claim, which is that people enter situationships recklessly, where each person has a different expectation of what they want out of the relationship. So for example, one person might not be looking for a committed relationship, another might be hoping it will end up in a committed setting. The opening opposition will say, many people are wary of relationships and of the commitment that comes with them. Situationships can often bridge that initial gap, and in that sense create a relationship eventually, or at least a romantic setting that is good for both people, where expectations are somewhat aligned, and are unique in making that solution. So we're going to run through 4 possible extensions that would be delivered in this round, and openly unmute and tell me the answer to the question. So on the first extension, which is a closing opposition premise that says we are going to prove why most young people are scared of commitment. Who can tell me whether this is a vertical extension, and if it is, what burdens does it fill or how does it attempt to win the round? And if not, why is it not a vertical extension? Participation is key.
I'm so sorry, maybe because I'm ESL, what is wary?
Yeah, wary just means afraid of entering a relationship. Common mistake. I, in fact, typoed it at the beginning, only to have Chris then correct it for me.
Okay, so if both of them means like being scared of relationship, then this would be vertical because you try to run like similar, how you say headline, but maybe if CO uses different mix, then it would be like a vertical extension.
Yep. So this is indeed agreeing with opening opposition's premise that they want to prove this is important for people to enter a relationship. But can someone tell me what burden this attempts to fill and the reason that this makes it a vertical, or possibly a successful vertical?
I guess it tries to prove that the issue exists.
Great. So it tries to prove that the issue exists. And another crucial component here is not just that you're substantiating the premise in your opening opposition, that many people are afraid of entering a relationship and need an uncommitted setting, but also the word most is important here because it gives us a hint that what this burden tries to do is not just prove that there is indeed this need, which maybe opening opposition alluded to in some people, but attempts to prove through characterization why it is true that for most people, this is a primary problem in entering relationships, which, isn't spelled out explicitly here, but would probably entail explaining why for most people, the wish many times isn't to have a sort of asymmetric relationship where they're getting certain things but not getting others, but that the main problem they face in entering relationships is the fact that they're scared initially of a commitment, which is why they would want to explore situationships in the good way that OO has already used. So this would, in a sense, definitely enhance the opening opposition argument by proving this need, but also potentially solve the problem on the top half in terms of what are the motivations for most people that enter situationships. Next one. CO says uncommitted relationships are good. Who can tell me, horizontal or vertical?
Horizontal means not analytical extension, right?
Yes.
That's what this is, I think, because it seems like a different thing that's unrelated to the OO claim.
Why do you think that this doesn't rely on opening opposition's argument?
OO says that many people are wary of relationships, and this bridges that initial gap. And this just says that uncommitted relationships are good. I don't think this CO claim needs to be true for the OO argument to work.
Great. Okay. So closing opposition here is making a claim about the characterization of situationships. The CO is saying the situationships are often uncommitted, and maybe it's good for people to enter those sorts of situationships. But this not only doesn't rely on opening opposition's characterization of situationships, it also, in some sense, concedes or accepts opening government's argument, which is that often they're uncommitted, which is what allows different expectations to rise up. So this argument starts from a departure point that is different from opening opposition because it only relates to a characteristic of those relationships and not to a need to have any, and also ends in a different impact from what opening opposition would be saying, because it's not about getting necessarily more relationships that you otherwise wouldn't get, but maybe it is about why the uncommitted setting is a good one to experience. Next argument. Closing government would say there are too many romantic entanglements are bad. So this is sort of the flip side of the argument we just covered, with the slight difference being CG just says it's better to not have a lot of romantic situations in life. I won't ask you guys this, because it follows very similar logic to the example we just went through, which is, once again, this is an example for how CG could use something that is sort of conceded by opening opposition, or sort of is clear already from the top half, which is that people would enter less romantic experiences or not be able to explore every romantic wish that they have, and explains why the fact that there is this absence would be good or bad. Now, it is important to notice that there are many ways in which this argument could become vertical or could require some vertical additions. For example, probably the way in which you want to explain why many romantic entanglements are bad is by proving that some romantic entanglements could be problematic for you, which sort of threads on a similar line to what OG would be saying. But here, what you would want to do to make this a non-vertical is to explain why many romantic entanglements, independently of whether you opt into them as part of a situationship or a relationship, are going to end up hurting you. So it's better to only pick the ones that are most promising, maybe at a later point in life, which is a way of separating that argument. Finally, let's talk about how the final argument, which is CG would say, we will explain why situationships destroy friend groups. This is a pretty straightforward one. Does anyone have idea about how to classify this?
This is also horizontal because it's about a different actor and has a different starting point and ends at a different impact, which is targeted at friend groups and not relationships.
Yeah, and it is a good illustration of what Chris said before, which is that sometimes this extension that was extremely common in the NAUDC round where this motion was set is many times a strategy that teams use to try and deviate away from verticals, but end up explaining an extension that is very hard to explain as winning the round in the same way that claims that are more inherent to a situationship, which are the ones we've already discussed, are likely to. Cool. Next example, we'll run through it more quickly using a more hard motion. This house supports the US's pursuit of policies which encourage oil production domestically. Opening government makes two arguments. This increases the global access to energy because there's more oil. Second, this will encourage developing countries to shift away from oil, which is good for those developing countries. Opening opposition makes the argument that this is environmentally harmful because of extraction costs. And second, the fact that this will hurt oil production in developing countries on clash with opening government's second argument, saying that this will hurt their economy. So the first extension I want to ask you guys about is CO saying that they're going to explain why the comparative to this motion is that developing countries who haven't started producing oil yet will start producing oil. Is this a horizontal or a vertical extension? Ilya and Chris, I'm going to start calling on you if we don't have people. Okay, while people gather up, yes, Raul, go.
Yeah, I think that this one's horizontal, right? Because you're going for different actors.
Okay. Can someone tell me whether this extension uses similar or dissimilar burdens to top half? Because it is true that it tackles different actors.
Yeah, I think it's a vertical because O is already talking about how this hurts oil production in developing countries. This just expands what other developing countries this is also about. So I think it still expands on what O was already doing, just like in other places, but the burdens are similar.
Yeah, that's true. So while it's very true that this tackles different actors, and we'll talk about this as a type of extension soon, the contribution that it has to the round goes through a lot of the same burdens as top half. By the way, this is an example of a vertical that supports a few clashes and enters into a few clashes, not just one claim from top half. So this argument, for example, proves relative to opening government's argument that it increases global access to energy, that thus this access to energy could have been gotten from other areas. So it also fills a burden from opening opposition, which is why is the energy market globally going to be, how do we alleviate pressures on that global energy market? But it also does the job of proving why it doesn't necessarily hurt oil production it independently proves of opening opposition that it hurts oil production in countries that would have started producing, but it relies on the same burden that opening opposition has relative to opening government, which is whether this is good or bad, because opening government says we want to decrease the dependence of developing countries on this oil. So just for the sake of time, we will only do the next argument, and the last two you can do at home when you look at this again. So if CG says this undermines OPEC's monopoly on oil, OPEC being a global cartel that currently manages oil prices with many oil producing nations as part of it, what would this be, a vertical or a horizontal?
Well, I think it is vertical because it's a part of the case of global access to energy, but it has some specific burdens related to how OPEC operates and how it will be impacted by the motion.
Excellent. Okay. So it uses the impacting burden that opening government has on how you increase global access to energy in some ways, but the earlier burdens of the argument about the fact that you undo all sorts of monopolistic tactics from OPEC is different from the burdens that opening government will require to explain why just more oil globally reduces prices. So this is an example of something where the impact is shared, but the earlier burdens and analysis are distinct. Cool. So after we are done with this fun little game, we're going to move to talk about the 3 types of verticals we mentioned before, starting with burden filling verticals.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to start with talking about the first type of the verticals, which is burden filling verticals. So as you know, like nomen est omen, what does it mean? Is it like in the name? Basically, this is sometimes where top half misses an important link within their argument. So you as the closing half fill in this link, and basically by proving this link, make either impacts to this argument more likely or bigger or something like that. Okay, there are a few kind of different parts of the arguments or burdens within the arguments that we thought of, and it will going to give you some examples that could be extended vertically when we go through them. So the first one is like when there is a clear like analytical deficiency. So like basically you want to prove that something is gonna happen, and basically your opening give some reasons why it's gonna happen. It's maybe not as sufficient, but you want to just increase much more, analytically extend this much more by that same thing is gonna happen. Here we have an example from one recorded competition. So it's IBA Nations League 2020. It's a very good competition with some very, very strong teams. Lots of recorded debates, and I strongly encourage you to watch these finals. So the motion is, this house believes that comedians from minority communities should not base their comedy on stereotypes and slurs about their own groups. And basically what we have in this situation is that OG is talking about, there is a race between comedians who is going to become more offensive, and therefore, like, there is offensive discourse coming from these, comedians. Opening opposition is saying, no, but like these comedians are also members from minorities, they understand these context, they have some of these experience, so therefore it is not just offensive discussion, it's like more nuanced discussion. And like there is a clash of characterizations in the top half, like how does this look like, right? How does this look like when comedians from minority communities are basing their comedies on stereotypes and slurs, right? For their own minority groups. What closing argument did here, and I think very well, is that they are able to show this and say, look, there is this clash, there is a very limited, these are actual quotes for the round. So like, there are very limited analysis of the scope in terms of how much the different scenarios are likely going to happen. We're going to give you 5 reasons why balance shift from nuance to insult. So basically, they are able to see, look, what is missing in the opening argument is to explain of why their version of reality is much more likely than opening up version of the reality. And what we're going to do is give you 5, they themselves say, structural reasons why OG's version of reality is much more likely. As a consequence, the clash on the top half that, it wasn't a wash, but it was a close clash, now becomes one by a much larger margin after the closing argument. I'm not going to go over the reasons, and I didn't put it here in the slide because like I don't want to, write the whole speech. But the thing is, like, look, they identified why one burden that is missing in opening argument. They explained to the judge like what is missing, and then they gave quite a lot of reasons why, this burden actually is filled in closing argument. What is also very important thing to say, and like I really hope that you're going to watch this round. Because it's some really, really good teams. Like you can see literally one CA of future world extending on the one CA of the previous worlds. Like you don't have analytically or vertically extend. You don't see many of these instances, right? So what is very important for you to notice if you watch it further later is that like when they are addressing OG's mechanisms, they give credit when credit is due. They say, okay, OG does prove this, like fair enough, but like we also added this on this specific point. And they don't lie, we're gonna talk about it more in more details, but they don't lie to the judges. They're very, fair and charitable towards their opening, and opening still has reasonable level of analysis, but they are able to much more basically prove OG's case and analytically to extend here. So like, okay, one example in terms of here is like when there is a clear analytical deficiency, you can just add here like And here is one example that you should look at that happened. The second case that we're gonna discuss on the next slide is related to comparative. So for example, so like, what does it mean? It means like, okay, rather than just showing that, you know, your opening wins by some margin, you're gonna win by a much bigger margin on the same comparative here. Again, the example, this house believes that the EU should create a specialized court responsible for investigating and prosecuting political corruption across member states. I think this was ESL quarters of Burgas, Black Sea Euros 2020, was it 3? Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. So here OO says, look, corrupt politicians will paint this as a political prosecution. Then CA goes further and says, look, they explain why courts procedures are viewed as uniquely severe prosecution relative to other policy demands made by the EU. What does it mean? Is that like, look, after the, like, let's say that, you know, govs are not engaging with this and they have some arguments that are losing to both of these kind of claims. In this instance, opening position is winning by some margin. Closing position is able to increase the comparative in terms of how much they're winning this by explaining why specifically this is gonna, you know, be used basically by corrupt politicians as a tool to increase their popularity. Again, like even in the previous case, we are sort of increasing the comparative in the round, right? But in the previous case, the previous example, the focus was more that we are just filling the gap in some analysis that is missing. Here, the focus is more in terms of explaining why specifically something, you know, is missing that makes this comparative much larger. I would say there are sometimes overlap between all of these different types of burden filling verticals, but just we're gonna want to give you different kind of perspectives where, you know, one or the other sort of, you know, example, one or the other like burden is like sort of more into focus. So simply that you can see that like all the different parts and burdens of the argument can be vertically analyzed. All right. Yeah. So the next thing is the characterization. Again, something that is important. Way to like, because often one of these burdens that I think people are lots of time missing or not aware of is that you your case is predicated upon some version of reality that, you know, might be real, might be, you know, just base real or whatever, but like there is some version of reality in which your case makes sense. In different versions of reality, your own arguments can make more or less sense. Like they can have more or less impact, be more or less important, right? And opposition arguments equally can be more or less important, etc. Sometimes this is an overlooked burden, right? Because you're just looking at burdens like, oh, mechanisms, impact, you know, like stuff like that. But like one of these impacts is characterization, right? And I think often you can vertically extend this in terms of saying, okay, look, where is this debate mostly takes place in? And then if you prove this burden, you basically just change the comparative of the round. Maybe it's going to be a bit more clear with this example. So the example is this house would significantly increase government funding for research into the effects of genetics on human characteristics, development, and behavior. So this was Belgrade Open 2022, I think, some time ago. So good idea for extension. So ask yourself following questions, like how this funding is going to look like. What are things more likely to, like what kind of research is more likely to receive fundings? Who is allocating funding for research? Who is writing proposals for these grants? Who are these scientists who are leading these proposals, etc.? What are their values? What is these kind of communities, etc.? And like, why are you asking all of these questions? It's because you want to understand how this motion would play out in reality, right? Because you want to understand, okay, how this would look like. Because here, this can mean anything, right? This can mean that, you know, you're going to allocate government funding for people to see if, I don't know, different genders or race or whatever are good or bad in, I don't know, math or sport or whatever. It can be understood in terms of understanding if whether it's genetically predisposed your talent for basketball or for, I don't know, playing guitar. It can be understood in terms of understanding depression. Like there is lots of these things that can fall out into human characteristic development and behavior, right? And what often happens in these instances is that you have a top half that they're gonna just come and yell at each other in terms of, but you know, like you solved this, you solved that, we have racism, no, we solved racism, etc. And here it is good to ask all of these questions because it can help you in terms of understanding how our world looks like and whether certain aspects of this make more or less sense. In this specific case, I think you can think of, okay, surely, you know, how, you know, like, how's it going to look like? Is it likely going to be something about race and stuff like that? Probably it's very controversial. You can be canceled because of you doing this. There's a lot of consensus that, you know, these things don't influence many, you know, your characteristics and like behavior, etc. Like it's probably not something you're going to receive funding for, etc. Probably is going to be about some other aspects in terms of either skills, either predispositions for, you know, mental health issues, for depression, for stuff like that. And, you know, then it changes the comparative of the debate. So this way you avoid this pitfall into this, you know, these kind of arguments, like, you know, OG can say, look, we're going to show that, you know, there is no link between, I don't know, this characteristic or this minority and, you know, this, you know, genetics in this minority and, you know, certain characteristics. And then we solve whatever the issue inside you want to solve. But then opening up is like, yeah, but, you know, you might have skewed research and then, you know, there is a confirmation bias and, you know, then actually, you know, people use this as the evidence, but then, you know, stuff like that. You just say, no, debate is not around this. We change the comparative, right? The premise of all these arguments is that, you know, that we're gonna sort of go into this kind of research. There are different types of research. We're gonna prove to you what exactly is the most likely going to be the type of the research. I think here it should be this kind of, you know, development behavior in terms of like mental health and stuff like that. And then you explain how, you know, why it changes the comparative, like why it increases the arguments on your side and decreases on the other side and stuff like that. Okay. Again, the burden here is because the both top half teams rely on certain characterization of the world. They don't necessarily prove it. If you fill this characterization, you just are able to show, okay, the op arguments are being left out. Here, I would say even some OG's arguments are then less persuasive, and you basically a priori weigh with some of the OG's arguments, right? But then you basically sort of say, okay, this is what debate should be about. And like already you're in a much better position. Okay. The next case that we have is some sort of combination, like hybrid. So here we have motion distance supports the rise of mortal salience in media. There is a long info slide about mortal salience. I think Amitai might send it or not, but just generally, it is this awareness that we are all gonna die, and about that, etc. Apparently, I judged this round some time ago online. I of course don't. I don't remember this, but like I was told that I judged this round. And here, top half argues whether, you know, media foster good or bad awareness to mortality. And then CO won in this round in terms of explaining, you know, why, what are the alternative sources for remembering death's presence, why are they enough, and why they are better reminders than mortal salience. So it's like sort of, you know, mix of this, because you have still, you increase the comparative in terms of, okay, you explain, okay, why there are better ways to deal with this, right? But also like the characterization in terms of, okay, what is the world we are living in? And like, what are all of these things that lead us to this awareness of death's presence, etc. So yeah. Yeah, okay, so Amitai sent the info slide here. Okay, but the important thing from here is just to understand that like all of these things is not some disjoint union of different things that you need to commit to one of them, but it's rather the, you know, different kind of directions in which you can think in terms of what we can extend analytically, what is something that is missing, how to identify them, etc. we're gonna talk a bit later. Before that, just one tip on the burden filling verticals. When should you use the burden filling verticals? Like again, like few guidance. This is not necessarily the disjoint union of all possible situations. So one indication for runners of the burden is the extent to which the opposing team, let's say your CG op,
Ilija, Martin, can you just skip slide?
Okay, sorry, I didn't realize that. So yeah, either it's that your opposing side is directly responding to this burden, and therefore it is contested burden. You want to basically expand on this, or it could be that your opposing side has the premise that is kind of implicitly responding to this burden. But like if this burden is essential for this argument to make your side win rather than their side, then it is a good idea for the verticals. If you remember the first example, which was the race comedians talking about, like focusing their comedy about the race. In this instance, right, the main thing that is hanging in terms of who is winning the top half is like whether comedians are being offensive or talking, whether the comedy is being offensive or just talking nuancely about the stuff. And then CG is solving this thing and just increases the comparative. Similar in all the other examples. So yeah, there is also this tip. You can test yourself on the straightforward, the burden. Like you can you can try to outline. I think you should probably do it in the beginning of the speech, why this premise is essential for your top half, like why this is a very important kind of burden that is missing, right? Okay, yeah, I think that's it what I have for burden filling verticals. And then if I'm not wrong, then Chris goes next.
Yep, that's right. So the next section we have is on impact-oriented verticals. There are two important things to bear in mind as we move on to the different categories, so to speak. The first one is that this categorization we've prepared for you is kind of artificial, in that it's probably useful to understand the different poles along which vertical extensions can happen. But in a sense, properly impacting your argument is a burden you have to fill to win the round and to convince the judge. So in that sense, a lot of what Ilija has just very usefully outlined for burden filling extensions will similarly be true for impact-oriented extensions. What sets them out apart is that they often hinge on not so much demonstrating that something will happen, but rather either explaining more clearly what the outcome looks like, and also putting it to the judge that the impact your top half has reached is something that we ought to endorse or condemn, essentially. So it's something we should try to see be more widespread. We should accept the rise, for example. And often the issue is top half teams are making many assumptions about what's true and what isn't, what's good and what isn't. And whereas you often will have burden filling extensions for things like likelihood or like factual analysis, impact extensions will often be about normative claims. So claims about what we should be doing instead. The second thing I want to say before we go into the examples is that it's very, very important to be flexible. And we'll talk about this a bit later too. But the ugly truth is that you often will be in positions where you cannot really package your extension into a nice box and put a tag on it and a nice ribbon and everything is like convenient. And what I mean by this is that you often have to do a bit of everything if you want to run the strongest possible extension, right? And, in a sense, the debate which will have happened in top half is a bit of a puzzle for you to solve. And what you have to figure out is, what is the strongest way for me to insert myself into this debate? And this often will mean doing a bit of this and a bit of that, like, filling in some analytical burdens, filling in some impacts as well. So please don't put yourself in the position where you think, I either have to run an impact extension or I have to run a burden filling extension. But rather just always ask yourself, what is the strongest possible thing I could be doing right now? As in, if my opening team could like redo their speeches, what do they wish they could have done better? And do that for them essentially. So let's go into some more specifics then about impact-oriented verticals and what we mean here. The two examples we have here are these. Like the first one is, and this will be very common, is that teams will say something like, if we implement this policy, the outcome of this is that the far right is going to rise, and the far right rising is a bad thing. And then, there are various ways in which government could contest this, for example, right? So, government teams may either say, well, no, this actually won't lead to a rise to the far right. Some government teams may try to say, well, we shouldn't take the rise of the far right to be a bad thing. But far more commonly, Gov is probably going to say, well, we don't actually think this is that big of a deal. As in, this is like probably a marginal impact. It probably happens anyways, this and that. And the thing I want to highlight here is that the reason it's really important to impact your arguments isn't just that the other side is going to get up and say, well, we actually think the far right is great. And this probably isn't going to happen in your debate rooms. But rather, good impacting makes it clear to the judge just how important the argument is. And especially in debates like this one, you'll often have values that are like fairly incommensurable with each other. Like that is, it's not immediately apparent how I trade off things like political rights versus economic growth, for example, or how I trade off, having more political diversity versus controlling extremism. Like, those are things which are related, but are not the same. And the reason then that impacting matters is that you're giving the judge the language and the understanding for how these things trade off. And the reason then why we should be explaining why it is that the rise of the far right is a bad thing is that it then becomes far easier to explain why it's more important than whatever the other side is saying. And so that is why, even when you think that you are reaching an intuitive impact that like no reasonable person would disagree with, you should still go through the trouble of articulating what it is that makes your impact so moving to the listener. And that's the important thing, which is that for any impact or for any argument, at its core, what you're trying to do is you're trying to motivate the judge. As in, you're giving the judge reasons to either adopt the motion or to oppose the motion. And in that sense, you have to boil it down and figure out what it is that makes what you're claiming so intuitive, right? So the question is, and I'll ask like openly, like if someone wants to answer either on mute or like in chat, right? Why is it that for like most people, it will be the case that they're like fundamentally opposed to the far right rising? Like what is so wrong about the far right?
That they oftentimes are speaking out against like marginalized groups or something like this?
So I think it's not just speaking out, right, but also about the policies we're discussing. Like it seems that often we're discussing like policy platforms that are in a sense like dehumanizing or like disrespectful toward the humanity of like parts of like the political community, right? And what I'm pointing out then is take that intuition, right? Like, wanting to protect others, wanting to guarantee basic liberties, and just use that to spell out your argument far more clearly. And then you can also work backwards, right? And you can go, look, if I believe that what the judge finds most intuitively wrong about the far right is their violation of individual rights, how can I make the impact more clear? Like, how can I characterize it in a way that makes that part of the motion far clearer, right? So, do more of the characterization of the impacting and explain why it is that the rise of the far right leads to dehumanizing rhetoric or leads to more of these bad policies passing. And so then, even where something is intuitive, don't be worried of sometimes doing these extensions as long as you're still pairing them up with weighing, basically. And that is to say, these extensions only work when you have a debate where the two sides don't completely agree on what the end goal is. Because if both sides are trying to like reduce the rise of far-right extremism, it's then just about seeing which side has the better mechanisms. So in the first example, we would want you to instead take some time explaining the ways in which the far right shapes like discourse, and therefore explaining like the more tangible harms of the rise of the far right, and then also like basically trying to layer your impacts a bit and saying like, look, even if the government mitigation is correct, right? Like, even if it's true that the far right isn't going to dominate the political field, why is it still harmful? Because it like radicalizes center parties, right? And why is it like, why is it true that it can be harmful even if it's in a coalition? So in a sense, your impacts become better if you can anticipate the possible objections to your argument, and if you can try to layer those in. Similarly, you can make your openings impacts better by explaining why they still stand or why they're still winning and more important than the other side, even if the other bench's arguments are true. And like, this is probably like the purest form of like vertical extension. And this is something which can be and should sometimes be credited as round winning, which is that if at the end of top half, you're closing government, if opening opposition is beating opening government at the end of top half, even if all you do in extension is weigh your openings case above the other side, that should be enough for you to win the debate. As in, you're filling in what was missing for OG to beat OO, therefore you beat top half. And the point I'm making then is, don't just go around willy-nilly expanding on impacts where it's not necessary, but only do so where it's clear that this is like a meaningful weakness in what top half is saying. And often in a debate that has to do with the rise of the far right, for example, the reason this will be a very important thing to explain is that it's going to be a very core issue in the round. Like, what is the extent of the rise? How are people affected? How important is it? And if you don't answer these questions, you are robbing yourself of the opportunity of making the strongest possible version of the argument you should be making on your side. Okay. Second example is like more IR themed, which is, tensions between two neighboring countries are now going to increase, for example. Take the time to explain what tensions look like, how people are like affected by this. And this, first of all, looks like explaining the rhetoric and how this will like also affect like the policies they adopt, right? Like, presumably if you have border tension, you presumably also treat the minority groups from your neighboring country worse when they're within your own country. The other thing is to explain why it is that you now probably harm different forms of like, collaborative policies that would actually benefit people. But also you can take the time to do impacting to make like outcomes sound more plausible, right? And an example of this, I think this was Cambridge IV 2020, was like, there's a motion about the India-China like border skirmishes at the time, right? And a very useful thing to run in a round like that is to explain why things like military escalation can often happen inadvertently, right? Like, you have one military unit that's confused about what's happening, like one misfired bullet, one person on the wrong side of the border who gets shot, right? And what we explain then is why, even if it's true that it's unlikely that countries want to go to war per se, it is the case that the existence of tensions can lead to escalation even where no side wants it. As in, you can get like leaders being forced to escalate to save face, essentially, when you get in those situations. So making the impact sound more plausible is also a very strong way to get this done. Okay, so next slides, please. When are these extensions strategic? It's often either that it's an outcome your top half has reached, but it's not something that's clearly normatively charged. And to put this in like more plain English, it's cases where top half's impact is not clearly a reason for or against the motion, right? The question is the rise of the far right enough of a reason for me to support or oppose this? The answer is probably, right? But you want to make sure the judge is really sold and like follows and agrees with what the argument is trying to explain. Similarly, if your top half has run arguments and impacts that are vague or like not really like tied into the argument they're running, just take the time to explain those more clearly, especially when those would be like a flip of the other team, right? Like if you can explain why the implication of what your opening has run is that the other team loses, that can also be a very good way in which you can run like an impact extension, right? So explaining, for example, why accountability becomes worse, or why political outcomes become worse. Like, just try to take what the other side's main thing is and show why it becomes worse. Similarly, this sort of extension will be very useful when debates lean towards trade-offs, as in when debates are not narrowly focusing on one impact and one clash, but rather when you're trading off clashes, you're trading off groups, you're trading off types of outcomes, then it's going to be really useful for you to go in and do the impacting and the weighing as well. So the risk here, of course, is that judges may say, well, your case is like analytically dependent on your opening and they're like logically prior to you, as some judges like saying. And like there are a couple of things worth saying here. The first one is that in many rounds, there's no shame copying a second. Like, if it's the case that this is a clear way for you to take a second in like, your bubble room at a major, that's completely fine, right? But more importantly, like there is like a kernel of truth in this, which is that oftentimes it will both be important to demonstrate why something happens and why the impact itself is important, right? And it's not necessarily true that you're always automatically winning merely by explaining the other part, but you sort of also have to contend with which of the two burdens was more important in this round. Like, which one was responded to the most, which is most contestable, right? Like, many of the things that Ilija was discussing in the previous section, will be questions you want to answer for yourself for extensions like this. So impact extensions then are not just about the impacting, but the weighing as well. Maybe use with caution and don't just assume that because your opening hasn't done the full impact and you can beat them by doing some more detail. But I think that's it for this part. And next up, we have parallel analysis, which will be done by Amitai.
Cool. So guys, for the sake of time, we're going to hurry up some of the slides, but I suggest that we're going to prioritize a bit being on time over explaining things in depth. So you can ask questions and obviously rewatch it if it goes a little fast. But this is probably a time to pay attention because we'll be going faster. So in terms of the last part and type of vertical we'll talk about, this, for lack of a better name, let's call it parallel analysis verticals. So the function of these extensions is that they often are a mix of filling burdens and impacts, in the sense that you should use them in cases where your top half has done a shallow job, but has done a shallow job across the important areas to talk about. So they've filled a lot of the burdens that they're talking about or provided a few shallow mechs and have some hint at an impact. So this direction is by proving the way in which the argument happens, not by filling a burden, but just in separate ways from your opening. And we'll talk about in a second how you can show that that path you have is better. But another way of winning by just having an independent path is what Chris just mentioned, which is that impact extensions are often most useful when paired with these extensions, because then you can win on the extent of impacting, even if your path towards proving it is only marginally more convincing than your top halves. So I want to give examples for what this looks like and how it deviates from the two things we talked about before. So the first example is this house believes that Brazil should classify major organized crime groups as terrorist groups. And here, let's say that OG does a lot of the shallow brunt work necessary for the broad argument, which is it increases sentencing lengths, it decreases incentives to join the gang, it gives police legitimacy to use overwhelming force, and then some impacting on why gangs are bad. This is probably fine unless there's a very staggering burden that's missed. But then what you might want to do as CG is pick a very particular path towards the way that this hurts gangs. So for example, having and outlining the problem in which many gangs in Brazil are funded through connections with non-criminal large real estate developers or infrastructure owners, where you have a very large owner of some stadium or a very large owner of some telecommunication thing, and they often siphon off funds to gangs because they're related to them and stuff like that. So this explains why often when you classify gangs as a terrorist organization, having any association with the gang is enough to seize your property, even if you yourself aren't committing a crime, which is a delta in the motion that OG doesn't talk about. And then you can get the same impact of diminishing gangs as OG has. Another example is, a softer example is this house believes that feminists in Western liberal democracies should use reconciliatory rather than confrontational approaches in their advocacy, which was a motion at Panama World. And here, similarly, OG might claim that confrontational advocacy antagonizes many moderates and traditionalists from the movement because it seems accusatory. So they would go through the obvious path of explaining why externally this looks bad. And then what you could do as CG is go for the same impact of being antagonized from the movement, but do so through explaining why the confrontational advocacy internally in the movement creates expectations from feminist leaders to be much more antagonistic and accusatory, and then explain why the particular characteristics then of leaders that are chosen and of the race between leaders to be chosen that represent all sorts of feminist movements means that those candidates themselves generate antagonism, not through your top half's analysis of the rhetoric being the thing that generates antagonism. So this kind of analysis is, again, a way of showing through leaders, but not through the rhetoric, why the antagonism is created. So when are these extensions strategic? So as I mentioned before, it's when top half has filled things in a shallow way and has not elaborated in great detail. And another important example is two sub-examples of this are, one, when your top half analysis proves a margin, but that margin is very easy to explain to not be changing that much because of the motion. So for example, if you only increase the amount of time you have to serve in jail, or only increase the amount of weapons the police has, it's often less tangible than something you could describe through a separate process, which is more of a turning point. For example, the ability to finally seize property that is owned by people who have a lot of funding going into these cartels. Another way in which you could frame the importance of your path over your top half's path is that as I mentioned before, impact that your top half's analysis gets is also something that you get. For example, you also get antagonism uniquely through leaders and not just through rhetoric. But there are many other impacts that your extension has. For example, leaders might manage the movement poorly, might make it a less accepting space, whereas the rhetoric analysis that your top half will provide will only apply to the metric of what the majority thinks and wants. So these are two very good ways of weighing separate analytical extensions and paths. So we're going to move on to the second section of this session, which talks about framing and strategizing verticals now that we understand what they are. Let's take questions, but since we are time pressed, do try to keep them to the end unless you have something very urgent. Cool. I don't know if it's because of my intimidation or not, but let's move on to the next part. So on framing and strategizing verticals.
I'm on the right slide, right?
Yeah.
No.
No, you're the next one. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, so very briefly, we already mentioned some of these things, but here we want to understand how basically to frame and position your extension, specifically like ones when they're vertical extension. How to explain the importance contributions, why the specific burdens that you're feeling impacts ways of explaining or whatever the reason or the thing that you're feeling and you're extending. And just generally in terms of how to understand like whether the top half has done enough, what's missing, etc. Okay, so on the next slide, so like there are, I think, three specific tips that we have. So just generally, I think our belief is that just the big struggle in terms of the vertical extension is that just teams are afraid of it, and that like there is this sort of aversion that like if you are saying something that is roughly similar to your opening, you are already kind of losing. And unfortunately, some of these kind of stereotypes also, are in judges. So like sometimes they are, like you need to be more explicit in terms of the judges what exactly is that you're extending vertically and like why these things matter. So one thing is like specificity. And I think this is a very powerful tool in terms of explaining why specifically something is, relevant or like bringing, proving the case to a much larger extent. but for example, like so this used to be a norm like a long time ago. Many of you wouldn't be around to see it, but like that, people would do it actually in the extensions, that they would come and explain, okay, we explain why specifically, this is something that actually that we are bringing. So for example, in the motion about funding, about, human characteristics, and stuff like that, state funding about that, I think the good way to phrase this extension, to position it, to say, okay, we're going to explain what specifically are the likely kinds of research that the research is likely going to be funded, and then why these things matter. Something that I think just sort of position why something that you're very concretely talking about. Just I think is a powerful in terms of framing your strategy. Okay, so on the next slide. On the next slide, we have something which is, I would say, maybe a bit controversial, but still something that should be seen as it should be in your tools, which is to point out the gaps in analysis. So just be aware of, different parts of the arguments have their own different burdens, and like burden is nothing else rather than the claim that needs to be true in order for the argument to be proven, right? And then that argument has its own claims, and like, we reach some level of other asymptotes or something that, just be a basic asymptote, something that we just, think is probably correct and cannot easily be sort of disputed, etc. So I think that the good ways in order to positioning and framing strategies is to say what are some gaps in analysis that you're opening the mess and why these things matter. So, for example, we here have this house would allow parents to be prosecuted for the crimes of their child. And here we have a framing that CG is giving. So OG says the child will care about their parent going to prison, but they never explain why. One, given the child's crime hurts many, why their pain is unique. Why the child will consciously know the potential consequences on their parents. Why do offenders strongly care about their parents to begin with? And like in the end, they also never justify why this impact should matter principally. And then like you point out here, obviously you need to also prove all of these things that you point out, but you point out few things that are missing in your opening, and then later just expand and prove them, give these reasons. Here, you point out to the judges, like, what are some gaps in analysis? So like here, do's and don'ts. Don't say, we are doing like OG it doesn't prove anything. Don't lie. I mean, we're gonna have a slide about lying later, but I want to emphasize it myself as well here. Like, don't gaslight your judges. We are listening, writing, often aware of what's happening. Like, don't say, oh, they never prove, etc. But like, if they're missed to prove something, be very explicit and specific. What are these burdens in the arguments and in the analysis that is missing, and what you are failing. And later in the whip, ideally explain why these things are so detrimental, like why, why do these parts of the answer that are missing matter, and why the judge should give you the win. The next tip that we have, so is, I think it's very important, is that you should frame your verticals as independent arguments. And I think it is important because I would say a few reasons. I think firstly, if you just say, okay, we're gonna miss the missing link, we're gonna fill the missing link, etc., you already kind of sound that you might be repetitive, and always the easiest call for judges is just say to stop half, closing half, didn't differentiate, etc. And I mean, sometimes they are correct, sometimes they are incorrect, but it is always something that the judges, if they're not sure, can use or just generally can default to. So therefore, like, I think already you're not sounding kind of repetitive. Secondly, it is much more clear in terms of what is being filled, right? And kind of more explicit in terms of there. I would say also it helps you to sort out your thoughts, to understand, okay, what is exactly what you are proving, right? And again, here we have a few examples. So, for example, we'll prove this allows us to eliminate corrupt cronies that manage infrastructure projects in the terrorism motion and the motion about just like you can have this in terms of okay, like you're not filling any analysis, you just okay, is this claim, right? You the name of the word, you just say, okay, this is the name of the argument, and then you explain it. Again, you still need to do the weighing, you need to still explain why this specific argument matters more, etc. But at least at the beginning of the speech, judges won't think this is a derivative, like there was nothing that was proven that is new. This is just repeating or stuff like that. Okay, so some of the tips in terms of how to position your vertical and are these three. Don't be afraid of them. Just be aware that you need to be very careful because you don't want judges to just say, okay, this was a top half, you didn't differentiate. Okay, and then we proceed with the next part, which is a prepping for verticals.
Yep. So I'll have to speed through some of this for the sake of time, of course. But we had some tips here in terms of how you can make better use of your prep time with your teammate when you're in closing. So next slide. Can I get yep. Okay. So the fundamental piece of advice is that you shouldn't just be looking at headlines when you're preparing. So, and this will be useful both when you're in top half and in back half, which is, even if you're on the same page on what you think the very important impact is, which, great if you've gotten there, try to think a bit about how the other side is going to contest it, right? And in a way, this is the same question as to what are the burdens of this argument, right? Which is, if I just said this headline to the judge, the question is, why would the judge still not be completely sold on this, right? And the deeper and more layered your explanation for something becomes, and the more of the burdens you identify and explain, the more persuaded the judge becomes, essentially. And of course, what you might say is like, well, Chris, surely I can just continue going like deeper and deeper, and there's only so much we can say in 7 minutes, and that's true. But there's a big difference between you merely like asserting something, which is, this policy is bad because people die, versus, explaining the steps of how you get from the policy to there, right? And the question, I suppose, at the end of the day is, which parts of your argument are not obvious? And it's not easy to articulate like a clearer test than this as to what needs to be explained or what counts as a burden or not. But, the question is what you're claiming something that very obviously follows from the motion, like something which is merely entailed by the motion happening, or is it something that you have to give some explanation for? And so ultimately, by asking these questions, so, what will the judge be asking me is one of them. What are the responses to my argument, etc., etc. During prep time, go beyond just headlining arguments, but figure out what the more specific sub-steps are. And the reason this is important is that you're going to avoid one of the very common pitfalls, which is that, people just have this short shopping list of arguments they've identified in the round, and you hear your opening say part of what you wanted to say, and you just cross it off, and you just end up saying whatever is left. And this is a very bad way of approaching back half. Instead, what you should be doing is you should understand what the steps for each argument are, and understand why they're important in a debate too. And if you do this well enough in prep, it means you're going to be more aware of what's happening during the debate too. So during prep time, take the time to see what the argument and the steps are. Notice if there are shared steps between different arguments, which arguments are easier and how you might weigh them against each other, or how you can weigh different burdens as more or less important. Or just which arguments are more crucial and stronger within the debate. So brainstorming shouldn't just be about what the argument is, but also about making sure both you and your partner discuss the strength of the argument as well. Next slide, please. So how do we prepare when we don't know what top half is going to do, which is a very good question, right? And the answer here is to cover your bases, basically, right? So try to figure out, after your brainstorm, assume your top half has done at least as good a job as you have, and that they're looking at the same material as you are, right? The question then is, which of these arguments will our opening probably have gone for? Like, which of them are like obvious or easier, right? And assuming they've done that, how can we try to like still insert ourselves in the round? And crucially, it's not just about what your opening is going to do, but it's also about what the diagonal team is going to do too. So you should ask yourself, does the round change depending on the stance or the arguments that, opening opposition runs against our opening government? Like, do we need to pivot depending on the responses we mainly get, for example? And often by noticing these things, you're going to be like better prepared when the debate comes. Crucially, don't put all your eggs in one basket and like try to anticipate your opening doing something like less expected or running the second or third strongest argument instead of the first one. Obviously, this doesn't mean you should like plan for your opening being like crazy, but you should be ready for like anything reasonable that top half might do. The other thing then is that by doing this, you should be ready to pick up on like the other diagonal team's rebuttal, basically. So if OO is beating your OG because they've given some very strong responses, that is a clear way for you to insert yourself in the extension speech, essentially. So with each of the headlines, then you should first of all consider what the burdens are for the argument and what it is that perhaps makes this argument independent of like some burdens that might apply to the rest of the debate. So, is this like a smaller impact? Is this far more likely? Does your argument work irrespective of how some actor reacts to the policy, etc., etc.? And identify all of these things because they're very easy ways to weigh your case. Similarly, ask yourself what your independent ways are of proving the argument that are like different than what your top half might do. So if you have different reasons or different mechanisms, and also try to like think of how it is that the ways in which you're proving or like approaching the argument are like distinct from what your top half might have done. So be ready to explain to the judge why your mechanism is different, why your path to victory is different, why your weighing is different, and like have some of these chats in brief during prep time if you can. Of course, you don't have the time to do this in full, and you'll need to flash it out during the round as well. But these are good like points to start during prep too. Okay. So next slide, and I'll just speed through this here. But main thing is after you've mapped this out, try to figure out how top half is going to do and where the rebuttal is going to go. Like I think I've basically already covered this. Last thing then is just during the round, just make sure you're communicating with your partner and share thoughts on strategy as the round goes on and let your whip know what you're thinking of doing in extension. And I say this as someone who's done both whips and extensions, but as a whip speaker, it's very, very useful to know what the extension is, even during top half, so I can already start thinking of weighing or what responses I want to prioritize or focus on. And the last thing, and the last thought I want to leave this on is be flexible, okay? Don't just go for the like cookie cutter extension or the thing that seems most convenient, but like listen carefully, turn off the part of your brain that knows how to judge, and use it to figure out how you would have won the round if you're in your opening's place. And use those fixes to beat the debate that has unfolded in the top half. Okay, very briefly then, Amitai is going to cover some of the like common mistakes, and then we'll continue with this part, I believe.
Great. So in common mistakes, we're going to talk about 3 broad mistakes. The first is spreading too wide. The second and important one is lying about top half. And finally, phrasing arguments in the way you phrase arguments relative to what top half has said. So the first thing I want to chat about is spreading wide. I think, sorry, was I muted? Okay. I think the first important mention is that a lot of the strategies we've outlined and types of extensions that you can deliver are extremely supported by going deep rather than going wide. So this is often counterintuitive to some teams that are executing verticals, where they might try to sort of brute force their way into proving an argument more strongly than their opening by adding many mechs into different burdens. And it is very possible that you would be able to add more extent technically to those burdens. The problem with this, though, is that judges many times look for a reason why top half is insufficient and not just for who determines a burden more strongly. So that part is much harder to do when you're making many claims about those burdens or about those things that you think are missing in top half, it is much easier to pick a specific layer of analysis you think is convincing either for a certain burden or more generally parallel to top half's argument, because that allows you to use the framing strategies we mentioned before of mentioning all sorts of extent burdens that your top half misses and of packaging your argument in the way that it fills things about top half, which might not be true about if you have many different sort of pieces of argument. So lean towards depth over breadth when you're delivering vertical extensions. The second thing to talk about is lying about what top half has done. On the next slide. So this is a very common trap where some teams, usually because of fright, fall into the trap of framing an extension as filling a burden or substantiating something that their top half has not fulfilled, even though their top half has said some things on this burden. So this could either be a tracking issue or a wanting to gaslight because you don't really know how to do the framing yourself issue. And I think the part of it that is confidence related will really be helped by you practicing the sort of framing we mentioned before about how to mention extent gaps while accepting what the top half did say. But even if you are not sure about the way to frame your extension and what it does, it is better to leave it more ambiguous and to use all sorts of weighing mechanisms that you do think are convincing, as opposed to saying that you're filling something in absolute that your top half hasn't said. And the reason is the same intuition we mentioned about judges before, where the crucial thing you want to point out to the judge is that there is an issue with the top half that they have not yet noticed or that they have noticed and that you are fulfilling. But the issue that your judge will notice is not that your top half didn't say anything about that burden. The issue will be the ways in which they've delivered this content. So you don't want to antagonize your judge by making it seem that you misunderstand how to place your top half's content in the round. And this is also a reason for why, if you feel that you have tracked top half poorly, often lean towards the side of believing that they've said something, but still outlining the problems with extent, as opposed to assuming that they've said nothing on this topic, because there really isn't too much that you could lose by saying top half has said something ambiguous, we will fill these specific burdens. So avoid lying about top half. Third last mistake is relying on too many technical or cookie cutter phrasings of burdens or other meta terms when you're using verticals. And I think this is actually something that many people don't understand is really, really constricting in terms of your ability to use verticals. Why? Because many people, especially in sort of mid rooms, who understand well how to strategically enter a debate if there is something that's missing, will then trip up when trying to phrase what it is that's missing. And the way that they often trip up is not only by saying that the top half didn't do something, but by framing their own contribution as being, for example, we will fill capacity or incentive analysis the top half didn't have, or we will give likelihood analysis. And these things are often not just vague, and make it hard at the beginning to know where you're entering. The bigger harm of them is that often the judge will have an intuition of what the likelihood or capacity analysis is, and they will know some things top half has said on this topic. So they might enter all sorts of things that top half has said into the burden you're trying to fill, which is more specific than just general likelihood. So I want to give an example. In the genetic research motion, OG might say, CG might say, OG don't explain the likelihood of bad actors dominating genetic engineering, which will not exactly be true because the judge will think, wait, but OG gave all sorts of bad actors that could enter and could do bad things. They've given all sorts of reasons for why those actors want to or are dominant. So a more specific phrasing that's relevant to the round and uses the terminology of the motion rather than meta terminology forces you to be more specific about what your top half has missed. So here, when you explain maybe OG don't explain why firms with data mining interests, I mean, they have said they exist and they're powerful and they have strong interests, but they don't explain why they overcome academic checks and balances, which is specific to research and specific to the actors that have already been mentioned in the motion. So it makes it much easier when you use this terminology to use burdens that are more specific than broad burdens that your top half has missed. That's it for our session. We finished only 10 minutes over, so we do have time for some very quick questions. So does anyone want to ask anything about any of the sections that we have covered?
Yeah, I have a question about the impact extension, if possible.
Sure.
So basically, you kind of already answered it in terms of like how it might be seen as contingent on being opening, like your opening reaching the outcome. And then what you kind of preemptively said to this is like, oh, but then sometimes it's okay to take a second, and sometimes it's the most strategic thing to do. But somehow, in my experience, judges are not even willing to credit that impact to you. So they're kind of saying like, oh, you did an impact, something that your opening already proved. So they kind of take it, and then they kind of, oh, let's now look at like the responses that you gave to the opposing bench. So they never actually use that impacting against like both opening halves if you're CO. So do you have any tips on how to like make them credit this to you so that like you don't lose material in this way?
Well,
I'll say one quick
very
thing and then I'll turn over. Sorry, I'll say one very quick thing and then Chris, if you have anything else to say. Just that I think one very important tool, like I agree about this tendency, but I think one important tool, other than having an independent path that you can yourself concede, doesn't necessarily beat your top half by proving it better and then using your impact. Another tool you can use if you're purely doing an impact extension is trying to outline what in top half is obvious and cannot be like, and isn't creditable to OG because it is either part of a concession or it is clear from both top half teams' analysis that some margin exists already. So in some cases, the way to frame this is your opening will have done a good job proving why the right wing increases substantially because of this move, but your opening opposition contests only the extent to which this happens and themselves often admit that the right wing will rise due to this motion because of parts that are inherent to both teams' analysis, I think is good phrasing. Chris, do you have any other thoughts, or Ilija?
Yeah, so don't rely on your extension being like implicitly responsive to the other side or being like the extension here and the response is there. Like if your worry is that the judge is going to say this was completely derivative and you didn't add anything, then clearly present the way in which your extension is responding to the other side. As in, if the value you're adding by explaining the impacts better is that you're now more responsive versus the other bench, or that you're filling in the missing weighing or explaining that the margin, just say that, right? And then it's the judge in the OA at least has to explain why that isn't true at that point, instead of just having the extent, like, don't think of extensions in this like weird dichotomy where it's like the extension here and the response is there. Like, both of those are of course different categories, but they're the same type of thing in that they're ways of you persuading the judge, right? So if what you're saying is that the judge was not crediting your extension as being valuable, then you either have to explain why your extension was responsive and why it actually did like advance your bench's case, or if that's not true, that probably was not like a very good vertical extension to be running in the first place.
Great. Max?
Yeah, I have two questions. The first is, in your experience, what is the best thing for a WUDC speaker to be doing to assist vertical extension? Because like the problem with vertical is that they require a lot of in-round communication and careful tracking and coordination might even detract from that. So if you guys have any tips for that is my first question.
Ask your second and then we'll answer.
Okay, my second question is the following. Can you weigh? Okay, so my understanding is that new weighing can count as entirely new material. So for instance, I'll give an example. The motion was like, this house would rather be born as a K-pop star than like as a normal person than a K-pop star. And OG runs the claim that like being born as a K-pop star will make you miserable, and that being in the K-pop industry is immoral because you're complicit in bad things. But let's say they don't impact the second argument well, as in why you should care about being immoral. CG can obviously extend and explain why morality is like an important part of what you would want to live. And if OO has only run a claim on, you being happy, presumably they could weigh that against OO. But can they weigh the argument they're extending off of OG against OG, the rest of OG's case? And how can you explain that to a judge in a way which doesn't sound like you're losing?
Okay, cool. Ilija, do you want to take this and Chris the first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would definitely say that if you do weighing why, morality matters more than happiness, or like matters more than anything else, either one or two. I would say that definitely it is a valuable extension. The reason for is just generally, like, as for many of the examples that were given in the presentation, you increase the comparative of the point, right? Because after the top half, it is unclear whether you should care about the living a moral life versus living a happy life. And then you say, okay, here are the reasons why given a happy life. Again, watch IBA debate. I would say like something similar has been done there, right? I would say like, okay, like there was a clash on the top half, and like Stevie was saying, okay, we're gonna give you 5 reasons for resolving this clash. They didn't frame it like this. They were just more explicit what they're doing. I think these kind of framing actually do work. Again, just try to how do you say, use many of these tips, and to see that even if the judges will still disregard your extension, your vertical extension with all of these tips. As for the communication with the web, so I think, or like what the web should do, I think, like, again, maybe there are 2 questions here, but I think communication the web, it is a bit tricky. I would say having a paper between you where you're just writing something, having a way to how to write and communicate. One thing is definitely to have all of these ideas, which are not just the names of the argument, as I think Chris said, but rather also the names of the specific burdens, pieces of analysis, anything that you think can be analyzed. And then I think between the speeches, you should be able to communicate what is something that you're keeping, what you're not keeping. And then, yeah, I think it's, I would say it's mostly that. And as for the web, yeah, I think the web should definitely emphasize why these addendums matter. In a similar way as a member, I think the member already with the verticals have to explain why their extension, how it is positioned, because otherwise you risk getting into a trap of, they don't differentiate that much, and then the judges might not even listen that carefully to the web. But I think once when you've done this positioning, the whip can expand on this positioning, explain the importance of, you know, your specific, just further explain further analysis on these points. I would say also the second thing that whip can do is just have a new and unique responses to the other side that are not contingent on anything that your opening counterpart said. Why it is important is because I think that then even if judges don't buy your vertical as being more persuasive than their opening, which might happen even if objectively it is, I think at least you assure the second place because your responses are just enough to with some of these verticals to take over the opposing sides. Yeah, I think I don't have anything to say on that on these 2 questions.
Thanks.
It also turned dark in Denmark, where I'm right now. So I suppose we will move on with the spar, but maybe first, big thank you to Amitai, Ilija, and